Welcome to Storytime with the Dangerous Gentleman. Why am I doing this? Why am I telling my story? Well, growing up, I kind of thought that maybe I would be an author someday. But outside of a few articles published here and there, I really haven't written anything worth note. My life is kind of interesting, though. I'm not bragging about my story. My story isn't any better or any worse than anyone else's. I think everyone has a story worth telling. So why am I doing this? Well, I've had enough people over the years tell me that they think my story could help people. I've been through a lot. Some good, some not so good. I've learned a few lessons along the way, and I've become a much different person than I used to be. I've actually become the type of person that I kind of admire. And so it's with that idea that I tell you my story, or I should say my stories. I'm going to jump on here once a week or so, and whatever story pops into my head and whatever lesson I learned from that, I'm just going to tell you about it. A couple of things to just preface this. Number one is that I'm going to tell these stories from my perspective and my bias. I'm just going to tell you straight up front, I don't think anyone can tell a story without their own bias. So I'm not going to try to tell you that these stories are objective. I'm going to tell you that these stories, I'm probably going to be the central character most of the time because it's my story. And it's going to have a little bit of my bent to it. I'm not going to apologize for that. The other thing is that I'm going to tell you is that I'm probably going to get a few facts wrong. And that's not on purpose. And if I get anything really wrong and someone hears it, I'm open to them telling me. The Mandela effect is a real thing. You may be wondering what that is. The Mandela effect is the idea that you tell a story enough times over and over and over again that even if you have some of the facts wrong, you start to believe that that's the way that it happened. And then you may find out years and years later that you were wrong. But it's not that you're lying. It's because you actually have started to believe that. And so there's going to be some of that too. It's going to have my bias. It's going to have my bent. And it's going to have some things that I might get wrong. But the lessons are real. And I hope that they benefit you. So please come along on this ride with me. Looking forward to it. The first story I'm going to tell really is in a lot of ways the crux of the whole situation. So I'm going to start it the way I started sharing it in so many different NA meetings and testimonial times. And it goes like this. On April 8th of 2014, I went to bed with the American dream. That is, I had a beautiful wife. I had 3 wonderful children, ages 3, 2, and 1. We lived in an almost new 3-bedroom house in a gated community in a nice part of Spokane, Washington. There were 2 cars in the garage that were almost paid for, and I had a job, well-respected job, working as a chiropractor, making $80,000+ a year and going up every year. Back when that amount of money actually meant something. Had a great church that I was attending, had a decent circle of friends, and I was just really, I felt like I had it all together. I was like, this is what I've been working for my entire life. Well, by the time I went to bed on April 9th of 2014, that had all started to crumble away. Then over the course of the next 2.5 years, my life proceeded to fall apart. Lots of stories about that time in my life, but we're going to skip ahead a little bit for now to January 5th of 2017. That's when I arrived in Yakima, Washington, with everything I owned in 2 suitcases and a backpack. On a bus, because I didn't even own a car anymore. My new employer picked me up at the bus station, drove me to my apartment that he had to co-sign for because my finances were in such a mess that I couldn't even manage to get a lease. I couldn't get approved for a lease. So he co-signed for my apartment because he really wanted to help me out, and he really wanted me to work at this job. So after he signs for my apartment, we drove to the office location. He helps me get things set up, shows me the computer system. We get all that set up. He then took me to Walmart, where we bought a few supplies, an air mattress, a few dishes, and some food. And then he gave me some cash. He took me back to my apartment, dropped me off, and said, "Good luck. I'll see you next week." There I was in Yakima, Washington, where I didn't know a soul. And all by myself, ready to start a business. It was one of the, if anyone remembers that winter in Yakima, there was so much snow that year, like more than I could remember, even, and I had 2 pairs of shoes and no car. So every day I would have to trek from my house, and I would walk through all that snow wearing 1 pair of shoes, and sometimes I was able to catch the bus and sometimes not, but regardless, my shoes and my feet would be soaking wet by the time I got to the office, which is why I always brought my 2nd pair of shoes to the office. And I would do the Mr. Rogers where I would take off 1 pair of shoes and put on the other pair of shoes, and I'd take the wet shoes and I would put them over the vent so that they could dry by the end of the day. And then at the end of the day, I would switch and I would walk back. And again, sometimes I was able to catch the bus, in which case it was still about a 20-minute walk. If I wasn't able to catch the bus, it was about a 45-minute walk. And then I would get home and I would have 1 soaking wet pair of shoes and 1 pair of dry shoes, and I would just rotate them. Usually I would try to, that's where I started to meet the first people I met were through Narcotics Anonymous. And there was a meeting halfway between my house and the office that if I walked from the office to the meeting, I would get there just a few minutes before it would start, and I would sit in the meeting for an hour, and I would have a cup of coffee and get warmed up, and then I would finish walking home. That's where I actually met the first people that I knew in Yakima. And that's where I started to really get my life together. I learned how to be honest, I learned how to tell my story, and I learned how to put things in context. I learned that I wasn't the only messed up person in the world, and there were plenty of other people who had been through similar stuff to me, if not worse. I learned that my story was just my story. That's all it was. And that my story got me to where I was, but it didn't have to continue, it didn't have to determine where I went from there. Now, as you can imagine, there were a lot of stories between April 8th of 2014 and January 5th of 2017. And there's been a lot of stories since then. And there were a lot of stories before then. During that period of time, that's where everything fell apart. And I went from having the wife, the kids, the car, the house, the job, to having none of that. I lost my wife, my house, my kids, my car, my job. I lost everything that I owned, down to 2 suitcases and a backpack. And spent a night in jail, spent some nights in detox, spent some nights sleeping on the street. And this is not stuff I'm proud of, but this is my story. And so that's where I'd like to begin. I'd like to lay that foundation. I haven't always been the fine, upstanding citizen that you may or may not think that I am to this day. But it was that period of time that really started the foundation for where I am now. And so, if you're interested, if you're willing, we'll walk down that road. We'll take that path, and I'll tell you what happened in between there. I'll tell you what came before, and I'll tell you what came after. And hopefully we'll learn a few lessons along the way. Stay tuned.